Okay, so we're going to be talking today about how to be confident handling difficult conversations. And typically the main things that get in people's way for difficult conversations is the confidence to do it, and then also the skill to do it. It's really just a learned skill that we all can learn. And the final thing is it takes time. Like once you learn these principles, it still takes time to think through how you're going to approach it and also practicing having them. But it's definitely something that we all can achieve. And so I'm going to start with a scenario. And so let's say you have a scenario with so you have a colleague, maybe typically a male colleague, if you're this classic female situation where they're dominating the meeting. Okay, so the scenario is you're at a client meeting. Every time the client asks you a question, your male colleague jumps in and talks over you. So what would you guys do? Like maybe put in the chat. Let me see if I can see the chat. Would you say 1, 2, or 3? Would you stay silent, try to say something, not sure how to go, or you would know how to discuss the situation or address the situation constructively? Yeah, so we've got 2 people, most people saying 2 so far. You would say something, yeah, 1 or 2, yeah. Cool, yeah, so that's definitely the most common thing. It's very hard to know how to address this kind of situation, and we try to say something, or we might not even say anything at all and feel resentful. Wait, where's the next button? My computer's stuck. Oh. Okay, here we go. So it's common to have a hard time with difficult conversations. 90% of managers don't like giving feedback. Only 14% of employees are comfortable speaking up. It's consistently hard for everyone. Now, however, are opportunities, and this is the thing you often will hear in conflict resolution. People will say, well, transform conflict into opportunity. And it's not just like this airy-fairy positivity. It's actually very true, right? Difficult times are when values are at stake. They're an opportunity to talk about something important. They're an opportunity to learn about something under the surface, to learn about people, to strengthen relationships, to build trust and motivation. So there really is an opportunity. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll have a sense for how to transform or how to find the opportunity in difficult conversations. So today we're going to go over social neuroscience. So my PhD actually was in neuroscience. And then we're going to talk about the 5 steps of mastering difficult conversations. We'll show you lots of examples. And then afterwards, we'll workshop any individual situations that you might have that you would like to talk about. So, okay, so about the brain. So the first thing we have is like we've got a me center. Okay, so what we have is part of our brain designed to represent anything that's to do with ourselves. So our identity, our possessions, what we look like, our friends, our associates, our ranking, anything that we like. There's this brain circuit that activates that alerts us to anything to do with ourselves. Yeah, so that's something that exists. We also have, but if that's all we had, we'd always, be at odds with other people's perspectives because we have a very unique view on the world, right? So we're not going to agree with other people. But what we do have also that allows us to be social creatures is we have a perspective-taking center. Right, so this is actually one of the components of empathy in the brain. Is there is literally something, a neural circuit that allows us to take the perspective of other people. Some of it is that mirror neuron stuff that maybe many of you have heard of. We have mirror neurons that mirror other people, but there's more than that. And it allows us to simulate something from another person's perspective. It allows this person to see it's a 6, even though it's not what they see it as. So another part of the brain is the social threat center, which maybe you've also heard of. So the idea is if we perceive anything to be socially threatening, like judgment or blame, this part of our brain, which is the same part that covers physical pain and physical threat, will light up, and then we'll tend to want to fight or flight or freeze. So we're not going to be able to deal constructively or have people listen to us constructively if the social threat center is activated. And also the other thing is emotions are contagious, right? So if you have negative emotions in someone else, that's going to bleed into other people, and you're going to be worried about their negative emotion causing negative emotion in you. So that's it for the brief neuroscience overview. Now we're going to talk about the 5 steps for handling a difficult conversation well. So the first step is to just remember, even if you're saying no, if you're bringing bad news, if you're telling someone that their idea is terrible, or you're telling someone that their behavior needs improvement, it always comes from a positive place. Like every negative emotion that we have, every negative experience we have, underneath that are positive aspirations. And we can always link these to common purpose and positive intentions. So the idea is to frame the conversation, both literally in what you will say to them, but also in preparation for yourself, so that you feel like, well, I just really have good intentions here and I'm bringing something positive to the table. And so how do we do this? How do we find the positive intentions? First, one thing, when I say use positive language, I don't mean just like only stick to positive things. I mean specifically, don't use negatives, right? Say what you want, not what you don't want, right? So for example, instead of saying, I want to stop endless debates, does anyone have a reframing of that would be in the positive? So it's not saying what you don't want, but to say what you want. You can either type it or say it out loud, or
I want to have concise conversations.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Right. And so I want to find a way to have more efficient discussions, but that's exactly the idea. And the other thing about aspirations, they should be, for the general good, not something personal. The aspiration is not like, I want you to be better. I want you to be, kinder or more understanding, right? So that's not the kind of aspirations we're talking about. So instead of saying, I want you to stop interrupting, how can you make this a positive aspiration that's not personal to someone else? It's more just what you want.
Go for it, Nella.
Anyone have an idea?
You could frame the meeting with the group of people and say, to try to get the most out of the meeting today, we're going to all, contribute equally to the meeting by everyone having, a say each, maybe making it fair, instead of saying, I want you to stop interrupting. It's quite direct, to make it more of a inclusive, everybody contributing towards the meeting, everyone gets a say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can absolutely do it the more indirect way. And if you want to do it, you can also do it the direct way. You can say, I want to make sure everyone has equal chance to speak, or I want everyone to be able to finish speaking before someone else responds. Right? So both of those work. And I just want to highlight, being good at difficult conversations absolutely doesn't mean like being indirect. You can gauge it as you want. If you're talking to a very big supervisor, maybe sometimes you don't want to be as direct if your relationship with them is not very clear or not very secure. However, there's absolutely a way to be very, very direct and not mincing words, but doing difficult conversations well, even being direct. So my example was, I don't know why my thing just doesn't continue. I would like to finish speaking before you respond, but that's just a suggestion. Okay, so then another part of finding the positive aspiration common purpose is you have to do some thinking about what else is at stake, like what's beyond the immediate want, what else do you want, right? So on the surface, you might say, for that first scenario we had, you might think, okay, well, I want to be able to answer when the client asks me a question, right? I want to be able to answer. But there are other wants other than just that on the surface. And can anyone think of like other things that people might want? Like other aspirations?
Sorry.
You go first, Heather, there, yeah.
You would want the client to see that you worked on the project as well, and not just the other person.
Absolutely, right? You want the client to recognize everyone's contributions, yeah? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had the same answer as Heather, actually, to know that you contributed and you want to be recognized that you were part of the project and that you're interested and enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, exactly. So my suggested things were like, you wanted to have a chance to speak about the areas that you're in charge of. You wanted all the members of the team to be perceived as equal contributors. Maybe you want the client to have confidence in all team members, not just one, right? So they have a stronger view on the team. So yeah, that's great. So then you frame the you frame the conversation with that, right? You can maybe even say, like, I want to have a chat about what happened at the meeting. I want to be able to, I want the client to have confidence in all members of our team, and I would like to be able to speak more about the areas that I was working on, something like that. Okay, so now we go on to step 2. And so step 2 is the whole point is like difficult conversations are difficult because negative emotions might be at stake, right? And I think many of us might always want to have the perfect, like, calm demeanor so that we can always do the best thing. And so the big part of knowing how to manage difficult conversations is knowing how to manage emotions, supporting emotions, because manage always sounds like suppressing it, which is absolutely not what is the best way to support emotions, but also learning how to support your own emotions also helps you learn how to support others' emotions. Oh, so on the chat, Neela said you want to have next steps. Was that related to something here, or is
That was related to the first question.
The first one.
okay? And did we address it, or did I don't know if
Yes, it's fine.
okay. I don't know if I understood the concept. Okay, cool. And so, okay, so we're going to talk about emotional support. So there are 3 main ways actually in research that show how to reduce the distress in your brain. And the first one is if you remind people and yourself of goodwill and care, like that you know, supportiveness, that you care, that people care. So this is the neuroscience experiment. So they showed people like threatening faces, and this is that threat center that you see activated here on the right-hand side in this brain image that shows up when you see these threatening faces. And so you see this is on the left is like the signal. This is your threat center on average that was responding to the threatening faces that these participants were shown. So then in a different condition, researchers flashed up these caring photos of strangers on the screen. So they weren't directly personal to the participant, they were just random photos of strangers showing care. But what happened is if they showed the caring photos first, this threat response, the original threat response where they only saw angry faces was that big. Whereas when they saw the caring photos first, the threat response was reduced a lot, right? So you see that's like almost very, very low. So the point is that reminders, whether you're supporting someone else and you remind them somehow like, you know, I care, I want to help you, you know, I want things to be good, just saying those words, it might even be, you know, obvious, but it's worth saying. And also saying it to yourself, like, well, okay, you know, remind you of your friends, the support network you have, that you care, you know, that you wanted goodwill, anything that's just positive, because these were just photos of strangers, you know, showing caring. That reduced your distress response in the brain, right? So that's one way to help support negative emotions and alleviate. So the second way is this idea of labeling emotions. So this is something that people often are surprised at. They don't think that just putting words to emotions will do that much. And research finds, both in psychology and neuroscience, that even if you don't really think that labeling emotions is going to help you, it still helps you. It still calms down the distress response in the brain. So the thing about emotions, you have to be careful that we often think about emotions and we get them confused with interpretations or judgments about what other people were doing, right? So you might think like, oh, he was a jerk, they weren't genuine, or I could have done better. But these are not core emotions. These are judgments, right? So core emotions are things like I felt hurt or unsettled or bored, right? So these are emotion words. And when researchers find, they either had people remember a distressing event, or they put people through a distressing event, like made them watch something distressing. When the participants labeled emotions, either choosing them from a word list or coming up with emotions themselves, it reduces distress and it actually allowed them to think more clearly. So they were better at solving problems and puzzles after they did an emotional labeling task if they were undergoing a distressed emotional response. So that's the idea. So you label emotions, sit quietly, think about how you're feeling, putting words to what you're feeling, not interpreting what others were doing, but real emotion words, and it'll calm your brain and it'll activate your ability to think clearly and objectively. So let's do some examples. So instead of I feel dismissed when no one at work responds to my suggestions, like what's a way to so dismissed here actually is not an emotion, right? Because dismissed has to do with someone else. Emotions are things that only have to do with you. Another part of emotions is that it's indisputable, right? Because someone else could say, oh, well, I wasn't dismissing you. I was just paying attention to something else. I was just focusing on something else. But so that's why dismissed, we might get used to in our everyday jargon to talk about, oh, I felt dismissed, but dismissed actually includes interpretation of the outside world, which may or may not be correct. Like they might have actually dismissed you, but that's not the emotion. So we want to get at the root emotion that only has to do with what's inside yourself and that no one could argue with. Right? So that's the idea. So what would be an emotion that?
Upset, hurt.
Sorry?
Upset or hurt.
Frustrated.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Hurt, frustrated, upset. Exactly. Great. So I feel discouraged. I just had discouraged. Great. So what about it feels incomprehensible that someone would do that? Now, the word incomprehensible is a bit in between, right? You could say that like my shock and surprise, that's just, have to do with myself. Incomprehensible could be interpreted as a judgment, like how could you be so crazy, right? So that's why that word is a bit on the border, right? But let's assume that we're going to say incomprehensible still sounds a bit judgmental, like it feels so, I don't know, out of line, for example, that someone would do that. What would be some emotions instead?
Confused.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Disappointed.
Yeah, exactly. You could be confused, disappointed, angry. Perfect. And then what if instead of I feel you're annoying me on purpose?
Irritated.
Yeah, exactly. You can just say, I feel irritated or like I'm upset so this is the other thing that if you do want to, it depends on the situation. If you want to put an interpretation on someone else, right? So this is the thing that's going to be potentially triggering because you're saying, well, I think you're doing something with bad intentions, right? You're saying that. Now, sometimes if you really want to say that, make sure you just own that interpretation, right? Like if you're having an argument with, let's say, your family member or something, and you're saying, I'm annoyed, and I think you're annoying me. At least when you say I think, or I'm interpreting that you're annoying me, you're really allowing this possibility to say like, it's my interpretation, and I know it's just an interpretation, I could be wrong, right? And there's a big difference between that and saying, I'm annoyed because I feel you're annoying me on purpose, or I know you're annoying me on purpose, right? So I know feel and think and interpret sound quite similar, but sometimes when we say feel, it sounds so much more like certain, right? Like I feel like you're this kind of person. And so that can sometimes be more threatening to someone versus just saying like, well, it's my interpretation that you might be annoying me on purpose. Yes, and so I feel I'm being unkind. So this is now a judgment on ourselves, right? So again, we can be very, very harsh to ourselves. And again, the same rules apply as when we don't want to be judgmental to other people, it's not helpful. Being overly judgmental to ourselves is also not helpful. So what are some emotions that underlie this judgment?
Disappointed in yourself?
Yeah, I feel disappointed about what I did. I feel regret. So I feel regret around what I did. So cool. Okay, great. So step 2. So the idea is when we apply these to ourselves, the same principles apply to helping calm and support emotions in other people. So social support, everyone probably knows, is very well documented. It lessens distress, improves physical and mental health. And the best way to support emotions in others, so researchers have done this big document on all the different types of reactions you can have to someone else's emotions. And at the very worst kind was like invalidating them, saying, oh, that's a bad response. But in the middle, which is kind of okay, but not that great, was saying, oh, it'll be fine, don't worry. You're not actually allowing them to feel what they feel. And instead you're just saying, oh, don't, that's not a problem, right? And not even allowing it. And the best kind of response where people felt the most supported was where you sat with them and you encourage them to articulate their emotions. So in a way, you're encouraging them to go through the exercise that we just did, where we found the emotions underlying a situation, and you legitimize it. So you really validate them by showing that you're willing to acknowledge their emotions, help them explore it, help them elaborate on how they're feeling. And another thing, which we'll talk about in the coming slides, is also to understand emotions in a wider context and to link the emotions. And this is the reframing part, which is the third part about emotional support, which is to reframe negative emotions in the context of our goals, our wants, and our needs. And so linking it to that is another way of lessening negative emotions. So so my computer doesn't support video embedded in PowerPoint, but this is actually a clip from Inside Out, which probably a lot of you have seen, where they show like a really good example of allowing emotional elaboration and allowing people to, the blue person is allowing the pink elephant to articulate their emotions. So maybe we can just send the link afterwards, like it's a 1 minute, 40-second clip on really allowing someone to just sit with them. It's like, oh, it sounds really sad. You said you were sad, and oh, it must have been so disappointing. Was it disappointing? And again, if they didn't say the words themselves of the emotions they felt, it's best to guess, right? So the whole point is you're not saying, oh, you were so sad, because maybe they weren't sad. They're like, oh no, I was angry, right? So the idea is when you're allowing them to come up with their emotional response, have it be open-ended guesses, right? You're asking questions to help prompt them to discover it themselves. Reminder, right? So we have emotions because we have needs that are not met. And so under maybe every aggressive person or whatever, and as annoying as it might be to be receiving, a message from an aggressive person, like they're unhappy inside, right? So that's just something to bear in mind when trying to just to have that picture. Okay, so the third research proven way to lessen negative emotions is to reframe distressing events. And one of the best ways to do that is to reframe them to needs and values. So connect them to your higher goals, to your principles that you care about. So here's a list of some basic underlying needs that are universal, that most of us care about. And so another reason, which we'll talk about in the future slides, is if you do want to bring up when something upset you, we're going to link them to these universal principles. And this is actually can be seen as kind of like a bridge for empathy, because everyone can understand wanting acceptance or belonging or appreciation. So we really link it to these higher principles that all humans can understand wanting. And it's not like, so then it becomes not about, oh, this, you did this really annoying thing and you messed up. It's like, oh, it just didn't meet my need for, I don't know, integrity, or didn't meet my need to communicate or to have cooperation. And so we'll see examples of that in the coming steps. So let's take an example. So let's take a situation where the judgment is, it was inconsiderate of her not to let us know when she wasn't going to show up. So what unmet needs were there when someone just flakes? Doesn't let you know they can't come. And let's say you're upset about it.
Integrity and presence.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Consideration.
Yeah, consideration, definitely.
Closeness, maybe, because you might think they didn't bother with you, with obviously being courteous and letting you know that she wasn't going to turn up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Respect.
Yeah.
Respect, self-respect.
Communication.
Yeah, just basic communication, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great. And then so let's take another example. What if you go somewhere and then you just find everyone is really cold, unfriendly, and rigid?
You feel a lack of belonging.
Yeah.
Maybe safety, security.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And then what about when someone dominates the conversation?
might not feel appreciated if you think they're not listening or prepared to listen to what people have got to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lack of participation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It can make you feel like you're not competent.
Yeah, yeah, you need to feel confident. Yeah. Yeah, great, great. So those are great. And so these are just examples. Obviously, you guys came up with so many more beyond that. And actually, you know, for all these situations, a lot of times, like so many of these needs could potentially be unmet for any situation. And it really depends on the person and maybe their past experiences and what triggers or needs they tend to surface more often for the individual. And that might highlight certain ones for certain individuals. But, you know, for all these situations where we feel kind of, you know, distressed or socially threatened in any way, all these needs could often be at stake. So that's the end of step 2 in terms of emotion, just to start sorting out our emotions. So the main point is just really kind of like get your ground, you know, so sit down, get an understanding of what feelings you had, start finding a sense of calm, and then get a sense of the deeper underlying issues, which are these like more universal needs that you wanted. So you can start framing the conversation and to help you with the next coming steps. Does anyone have any questions so far? Yeah, okay, so now we're gonna go on to step 3. So step 3 is the learning to be very objective and indisputable with your description of the situation, right? So it's non-personal. So the whole point is that threat response, we cannot we don't want to set it off, right? We want to minimize any chance of it sounding personal, sounding negative, associated with them, sounding judgmental, blaming, etc. So learning this objective language to describe what's happening is very key. It just sounds very neutral, sounds very like, oh, this objective thing just happened. And the other powerful thing about being objective is that you don't get into like a, no, that's not what I did, that's not what I said, right? Because it's a completely objective, like holds up in court, they can't argue with that, right? Then you just really get to the situation. You don't start going this roundabout loop of whether or not someone intended something or, you know, really did that. Was it really, you know? So, right, so for example, like if you said to someone, just be less aggressive, like they might, aggressive is not objective, right? It's kind of an interpretation, it's a characterization. Someone could think that they were not being aggressive, they were just enthusiastic or, you know, their natural self. Right? So that's the idea. So one way to help practice objective descriptions is to almost think like you're a video camera or you're like seeing something through a video camera. So a video camera, you know, just captures what you can see or hear literally, right? So it's different from how we normally process the world. We naturally process the world in terms of our judgments and interpretations, and it's important, right? This is how we get by. This is how we choose what's better, what we gravitate towards, what we turn away from. So I'm not saying judgments are bad overall, and I'm not saying that the judgments are necessarily wrong, like the judgments could be correct. The point is that it's not useful when you're having a difficult conversations to use words that might trigger their threat response. And then, you know, now they're not going to be listening to you because their like brain is inflamed and they're worried about defending themselves, right? So we want to minimize possible defensive reactions. So what's an example? Instead of saying, you ignored my point, right? So ignored is kind of not, it kind of be like, oh, they purposely didn't pay attention to you. What's something that sounds more objective that you could say?
You could say, I said X and you didn't respond.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. And my suggestion was your response didn't address my point. Exactly. That's much more objective. What about instead of saying you cut me off?
I hadn't finished speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't finished speaking, you started speaking. Exactly. What about you always shout?
Your tone?
Yeah, exactly. You can say you often speak in a loud tone of voice. Yeah, so it's now not about like shouting implies like there's an emotion behind it, and some people sound shouty and they don't think they're shouting, right? So then they'll be like, I wasn't shouting. And then, then they might actually start shouting. So
this is quite funny because these three descriptions, negative on the left, I mean, this could sum up most of my meetings.
Oh, I actually have a video. I made some YouTube videos, and I have one specifically on people who are aggressive communicators, and specifically on giving feedback to aggressive communicators. So we can share the link to that, and it has like lots of examples of what you can say.
Okay, that'd be good. Yeah, thank you.
You should screenshot this one.
Yeah, and also sometimes I say, you didn't answer my question, or would you like me to explain, or maybe I didn't make myself clear.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, exactly. That's perfect. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's really about just building that vocabulary. I mean, it's just learning how these common situations that come up and finding these phrases. Yeah. So then we go on to step 4, and this is if you want to share the emotions. And so as we had already done previously, find the emotions underneath the judgments, and to express them safely. What I mean by that is we take ownership of the emotions, right? So we're saying, I feel this because I just had this need, or I had this value, or I had this unmet concern. And so why would we share emotions? I mean, sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not, right? Sometimes it's not big enough deal. Sometimes you don't feel safe enough, even if you share it safely. Sometimes, it's up to judgment call. But there are benefits, right? So it can increase transparency, and the authenticity can build trust, right? Because if you look really upset, and if it's a situation where obviously someone would be very upset, to own it helps people trust you, because then you're really acknowledging what, instead of secretly they're thinking, oh my gosh, she must be so pissed off, instead of saying, yeah, I was angry when this happened because I wanted this, right? That encourages a sense of trust. It allows you to explore the problem more transparently, and so helps you surface the small problems, because if you're willing to discuss it, then they're more willing to be transparent and honest, and it helps this, especially for small things. Then you're able to establish that willingness to discuss things openly before they become big problems. And also it improves understanding, because a big part of these conversations is the impact it's having on everyone underneath, inside, right? Difficult conversations are hard because we're afraid of all the negative emotions that might be involved. And without fully understanding the landscape of how people are feeling, what needs they have, what concerns they have, what are their values that get surfaced when different things happen, and what unmet needs are triggered when something happens. That's a big part of the picture of understanding how events impact teams and clients. So it is worth also doing it just to improve understanding, right? We can learn so much by understanding what someone needs, and different people for the same situation might need very different things. And that also helps you have that better relationship with that person by learning to understand them better. And then finally, this idea of psychological safety, which probably many of you have heard of. It's the psychological safety is the concept of being able to freely say whatever is on your mind and feel safe that people are going to respond safely no matter what you say. And emotions and our responses to our inner responses to things is a big part of what's on our mind. And if we create environments where it is safe to bring these things up, then we're enforcing psychological safety. And there's just so much research on psychologically safe organizations and teams and groups, and this is where innovation and bonding and flourishing and well-being, and it's linked to all these very, very strongly positive things. It's a concept from a Harvard professor, but now used very widely. So what does this look like? So we talked about finding emotions. So I won't belabor it. So instead of being ignored, you could say, well, I felt anxious, misunderstood, you might have been impatient. Again, this is just individual for every situation and every person, right? There could be loads of emotions you might feel for any of these. Instead of feeling cut off, you were annoyed. And so how would you talk about these emotions? So the idea is, as I said, we want to link these emotions. We express emotions safely by taking ownership of having them and linking them to our underlying concerns and unmet aspirations. So the idea is, by doing that, you're taking the attention away from blame of the other person, and you're focusing the attention towards your concerns and unmet aspirations. Right, so this is what I mean. So instead of saying, well, I didn't get a chance to present, I was disappointed. And that's like kind of fairly okay so far. You know, you probably could just say that, especially if you knew someone very well, you know, you could say that. But it's better to say, you know, when I didn't get a chance to present, I was disappointed because I really wanted feedback on that part of the project that I'd worked hard on. Right. So now the person has a deeper understanding of, oh, now not just they were upset, but like why, and they feel more empowered to understand, like, okay, no, she wanted feedback, right? Or this is the situation. You're really pointing towards the larger issue at stake, and you're bringing that general principle. And then this is also what I was speaking about before, where underlying needs serves as an empathy bridge, right? Because then this draws out them to be empathizing with you, because now you've told them, well, you know, I wanted feedback on, and so this, oh, I see, you know, so then they're able to empathize, versus if you just said, oh, I was disappointed. They're like, oh, she's so fussy. I don't know, right? It doesn't allow them to understand, and giving them further information allows them more chance to feel empathy for the situation. So similarly, when you don't acknowledge my point, I get frustrated. So what's something you could say that leads to an unmet need or aspiration?
Well, you're saying that you want to feel heard.
Okay, yeah. So you could say, I got frustrated because I wanted to feel heard. Yeah. Yeah, you could say that, definitely. Anything else? Any other?
It reminds me of when you're told to do marketing, you have to go to the why behind the why.
Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. There is a lot of like digging and it's a lot of clarity, like inner personal clarity to go through these things. So my suggestion was, you know, there could be so many. It's just, I wanted to know that you got what I was trying to say, which is the same basically as to be heard. Right. So instead of saying I was frustrated, just say I was frustrated because I want to know that I was understood. Okay, so now we have step 5, and step 5 is to check in and be collaborative and discuss possible strategies. I mean, if sometimes the difficult conversation is just you're breaking up, or you're finishing a client relationship or any relationship, then maybe there's not necessarily strategies. But if it's, teammate working, then you might want to discuss strategies for ways of moving forward. And checking in is very important, right? Because it's like, how is it for you, right? What's their perspective on it? What were their feelings and needs? They could have a completely different idea of what was going on. They might have had concerns or other circumstances that you just had no idea about, and this is a chance for them to discuss it. And so really you want it to be specific when you actually come up with strategies, right? Because otherwise the hardest thing about communication is that the same words can mean very different things to different people. And this is what just goes wrong in all our communication. There's lots of research showing that even like the longest term couples, like they took couples that knew each other for 20 plus years, and they had them talk about like their most talked about issue, which may be their most common argument or whatever. They had them talk about it for 40 minutes. They recorded all the moments where someone either said something and rolled their eyes or like sighed or any kind of marked moment in the conversation. And then later separately, they would replay that video to the partner on their own, like each partner on their own, and said like, what was your partner thinking and feeling at that moment? And like, guess what percentage of the time they were correct?
A low number?
Yeah, so for long-term couples, it was 50% of the time, right? So I don't know if that feels low or high, but that means for 50% of the time, even for their most talked about issues, for couples that have been together for 20 years, they were wrong about what the other person intended to get across. And then that just goes down, right? If it's friends or acquaintances, that goes down to 20% or less. So really checking in, understanding what's going on, being very specific about the language and strategies, because you can think you're being clear, and you can never over communicate enough when it's a difficult conversation, because there's just so much room for uncertainty and the wrong interpretations. This is where you use the perspective taking, and another phrase that comes up, I didn't write it down in the slides, is non-judgmental curiosity is a phrase often talked about in empathy, but really trying to find a way to be curious about their perspective on the situation. And this is why this self-work on learning to take care of your own emotions is so important, because you don't have the room to have non-judgmental curiosity for someone else in a difficult conversation. Usually, if you're worried about your threat centers, if you're worried about your distress, then it's very hard to maintain that open curiosity for someone else's perspective, right? So that's why it's very important to work on our own emotions and to feel that we can support our own emotions before we can support looking at someone else's perspective and their emotions. And so, check-in questions, you can say, what was it like for you? What's your perspective? And so this is just a small picture to remind us that, often we're not correct about what we think someone else needs, even if it's someone we know very well. Okay, so just an example of strategies need to be specific. Okay, so here's an example of a non-specific strategy. I just want to make sure everyone feels heard. What would be a more specific strategy that you could potentially agree on for someone that's being dismissive or not acknowledging people's points?
Well, maybe just before the conversation happened that how there's going to be a round, everyone's going to talk, and everyone should respect everyone's time. Yeah, exactly. So you could have that. Definitely, you could have that idea in place.
We want to make sure people feel heard, and because we want to get everybody's perspective. So a perspective will help maybe improve with the situation.
Yeah, so that's absolutely great in terms of elaborating more on the reasons and the needs why we want that. And so that's great. What I want additionally is if this person who's not very good at hearing people, right? So I guess the situation I was imagining is there's someone, they're not very good at hearing people, they just don't respond to people's points, then they still might, even if you told them that, they still might be like, okay, yeah, people's perspectives are fine, but there's they might not change their behavior, right? So this is trying to get us to drill down to something very specific to ask or suggest.
Maybe ask the person to take notes.
Yeah, exactly. You can ask them to take notes on what happened, right? So my suggestion was maybe you can ask them to summarize what you heard them say. Repeat back might be a bit too parroting, right? But that's a classic. Can you summarize what you heard everyone say in turn so that people know that they're getting their points across? Here's another example. What if you want someone to be a better listener? We could use the thing before the previous thing too. You could ask them to, can you summarize what you just heard them say? Is there any other specific strategies you could ask?
You could throw in random words and see if they pick it up.
So that's
I've heard of people putting that in long documents. They just put in random words in the middle of sentences just to see if anyone notices.
Yeah, that's true. That's a way to detect whether they need to be a better listener or not. Absolutely.
That's a bit micromanagement though. It's a bit awful.
That's a sneaky way, yeah.
I mean, if you're in a conversation with someone and you want to know if they're actually listening, just say it well, I was sitting at my desk bananas, and then, just say something random and then just see if they even, react to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I think I had someone do that to me and I wasn't listening and I got in trouble. Yeah, so absolutely. So that's a strategy for you to check if someone's listening. Yeah, so that's definitely a strategy for that. What we're talking about here though, in addition, what if you really wanted to you're discussing with them, actually did bring it up directly. This is maybe someone that's reporting to you. You probably, I don't know, most people probably aren't comfortable telling their boss, I want you to be a better listener. But, let's say there's someone on your team that's reporting to you. We discuss okay, I think some people aren't feeling acknowledged or aren't, getting their responses, aren't knowing that they were being heard.
Did you ask them to sometimes what I'll do is if I have a conversation with someone, I say, I'm going to send an email summarizing what we talked about. And then if you don't agree with it, you can respond in writing.
Yeah, no, that's great.
But I might have heard the wrong thing. Sometimes I think it's very possible that I heard something completely different from what they were saying.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, absolutely. This is something that sometimes you just need to change the communication like channel or the way it's summarized or add more structure. This is slightly off tangent, but I had someone on a team. There was a really grumpy engineer because he was so unhappy with how messed up the old code was that they inherited. And he was just grumpy to everyone. So throughout the day, if someone asked the question, like, no, yes, oh, that's terrible. No, like he's just so abrupt throughout the whole day. And then finally the team leader just decided, okay, we're not going to just have questions throughout the day. We're going to like lump all the questions into half an hour so that if he was going to be very abrupt, at least it was going to just happen in that contained moment. And so it wasn't like leaking throughout the day of, these like really abrupt answers. So yeah, so absolutely, there's lots of different strategies you can use. And I kind of just, my suggested answer was like a slightly, reframed version of the previous one. So, would you be up for acknowledging people's perspectives before you disagree with them? That's kind of assuming they were argumentative, which isn't clear from that prompt. Okay, so here's just putting it all together, right? So if you have like an employee who's very dismissive, you could say, well, I just want to make sure everyone feels heard. When you respond without acknowledging people's points, people can be confused. They want to be left knowing if you understood them and then not focused on what you're saying, right? So a lot of times, any sort of improvement in behavior that's desired, it's for the overall good, right? It's for the good of the person who needs to improve as well. There is a very positive aspiration. And then, one approach, maybe summarize their points first before making yours. So that's the end of the presentation part, right? So we've got your 5 steps and then check in and discuss strategies. And so now that we understand the skills, then it really takes time and practice and thinking in terms of preparation for lots of situations. And so what I actually discussed with Bridget, it's an optional thing for anyone who'd like to, because we're on a WhatsApp chat together.